Draw the curtains and expand your mind. It's time to get textual as we traverse the illicit pages of Wrongthink in the Forbidden Book Club.
Indeed. Welcome to the Forbidden Book Club, my favourite part of the show. I'm bookish. I'm a book nerd. I like to trawl the dusty corridors and byways of forgotten bookstores and book vaults, brushing aside the cobwebs and the detritus of ages past, and investigating what people thought, what they wrote down, and what is in many ways marginalized and forbidden to us today. Now, today we're going to do an absolute blockbuster of a book. It is, in fact, not literally a forbidden book. In fact, it's a well-known book, but I wanted to touch on aspects of it that are extremely relevant to us today, and dive a little deeper into this actually extraordinary book. It is, of course, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. In some ways, the book has become a cliche. You'll hear the term used in conversation sometimes, Brave New World, but it's actually an extraordinary book, and it really deserves a closer examination, in my view. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It was written in 1932, or at least published in 1932, which, as you will understand, is quite a long time ago now. And it's an extraordinarily prescient, timely, relevant piece of work. It is, of course, a fiction book. It's not meant to be a documentary book, although as the days pass, it looks more and more like one. So it was written by Aldous Huxley, who was a famous writer in his life. There's Aldous, looking suitably mysterious there. He was born in 1894. He died in 1963. We'll get to that before we end today's program. He was born into a prestigious family. There he is as a child. Everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people remarked that he was always an intelligent child. He was always he was described often as a thoughtful child who would do a lot of sitting around and a lot of thinking and a lot of asking questions. He was born into a somewhat illustrious or at least notable family. That's his grandfather, Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. So that's building on last week's episode of the Forbidden Book Club, if you didn't see it, about Darwin's doubt. So that's Thomas Huxley, Aldous's grandfather. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. He promoted Darwin's theory of evolution in all his circles, and was seen as a great publicist and a great advocate for Charles Darwin. That was Aldous's grandfather. His brother, Aldous's brother, ended up being Sir Julian Huxley, who was a very notable biologist and scientist, and he actually lived significantly longer than Aldous, and became a significant figure in science of the 20th century. That was Aldous's brother. And there were other luminaries in his extended family. So they were most certainly an illustrious and noteworthy family. A lot of writers and artists in his extended family. Aldous's father was a writer and an educator, and his mother, Julia, was a noteworthy writer, amongst other things. There is, in fact, Julia with Aldous on her back. I can't remember when that photo was taken, but he was pretty young, obviously, as you can see it. Now, coming from a prestigious and, in fact, elite family, as you could suggest that Aldous did, he was, however, not immune to life's tragedies. In fact, there are 3 formulative tragedies in his life that many have remarked might possibly have affected his temperament throughout life, and especially the books that he went on to write, and his approach to spirituality, and various other aspects of his life. There were 3 major tragedies in his life. The first of those was his mother, Julia, who you see pictured there. She died when Aldous was 14. She died very quickly and of cancer, and he was away when it happened, and it was, by all reports, incredibly traumatic for him and his family, as you can well imagine. She was a noteworthy figure. She actually opened her own independent ladies' school. That's a picture of it there, Prior's Field School for Girls, which is still in operation today. She was the head principal and the founder of that school. She died in 1908 when Aldous was 14. She apparently, on her deathbed, wrote him a letter that he reportedly carried with him for the rest of his life. And one of these statements in that letter is that his mother encouraged him to judge not too much and to love more. So that's a touching epigraph to write to her son, I think. In 1911, just a few years later, 3 years later, Aldous went blind. He got a strep infection, which I think detached the retina in his eyes, and he went in and out of blindness for the rest of his life. It did improve at times, but there were times when he was completely legally blind, and there were other times when he was haltingly blind. It was improved by sunshine. He did move to California later in his life when he was a successful novelist. One of the reasons he did that reportedly was to attempt to repair his eyesight. He also apparently, when he became a famous novelist, he was asked often to appear in public and give speeches. And he was shy about his blindness. So he would learn his speeches off by heart and then take notes with him so that he could appear to be reading from notes, but actually, apparently, he was operating from memory, but he didn't want to give that away. So he took notes with him so that he could pretend to have functioning sight. The third tragedy was just a few years later again. His brother, Trev, who they were very, very close. Trev was apparently, like all that branch of the Huxley family, a sort of gentle, warm soul. He hung himself in 1914, just a few weeks before the outbreak of what was then known as the Great War, what we now describe as World War One. Trev, very sadly, obviously, hung himself. There was apparently a few different factors in there, unrequited love and academic struggles and a few other factors. Of course, it would be difficult to know the whole story, naturally. But yes, he did unfortunately kill himself. This all, it's been suggested, added to a cynicism on Aldous's part and a world weariness. Then, of course, the what we now know as World War One, which was then called the Great War, or as H.G. Wells called it, the War to End All Wars, which unfortunately he was incorrect, broke out just a week or two after that. And that was something else that certainly added to a lot of people's cynicism and desperation and sarcasm. Aldous was known in many circles as an angry young man. He volunteered for the Great War, but was rejected because of his blindness. He tried to volunteer a couple of times, in fact, but he was rejected each time. He ended up working on a farm because he felt he wanted to contribute to the war effort. He struggled financially. He ended up taking a teaching job at Eton, where he taught a particular student who himself would go on to be noteworthy, one Eric Blair, who, writing under the pen name of George Orwell, would end up writing, there's Eric Blair there, otherwise known to the world as George Orwell, the character who wrote this book, 1984, was in fact a student of Aldous Huxley's at Eton. It's a small world, as they say. Soon after, Aldous married a Belgian refugee from the Great War, Maria Nice, in 1919. I think we've got a photo of Maria somewhere lurking. There she is. There's Aldous. Aldous was a very tall fellow. Maria was a very short lady, but they were, through most reports, most of the time, a very happy couple. Aldous struggled financially. He took a job as a journalist for House and Garden magazine, which I think is entertaining in retrospect. He then took his first halting steps to be a novelist. In 1921, he wrote his first novel, Chrome Yellow, which was well received, but it was noted to be a cynical and satirical book that existed in the shadow of World War One. Aldous wrote a number of books, some of which are pretty interesting, but when it came to 1932, he produced the book that he is best known for today. That's Brave New World. Ed, I think we've got some alternate. This is a fairly pedestrian cover, in my view. That's the first edition of Brave New World from 1932, which has a splendid cover. I love that cover. There are also, as was the want at the time, many pulp editions for the mass market. Here's one of them with that fantastic cover. The mighty novel of a soulless, streamlined Eden and the two who escape it. Fantastic. Now, today, because I want to highlight the timely and relevant elements of Brave New World, we're not going to focus on the plot. If you want to familiarize yourself with the plot, you can always read the book, and I recommend that you do so. It's actually an excellent book, very thought-provoking book indeed. We're going to focus on the world of Brave New World, the world that Huxley created to situate his characters in. And it's been remarked, a few times that the characters are, not entirely three-dimensional. They're a little bit sort of cardboardy, and they're there just to advance his picture of a dystopian future. And that is certainly what it is. It is a view of a dystopian future, and we'll go into that at length shortly. This is a recent graphic novel of Brave New World. Surprisingly, it's very good. And we're going to use some images from this graphic novel to illustrate some of the themes and the landscape of the world that Aldous Huxley created. There's also a couple of films of Brave New World, which I've never seen, but I'm told they're not that good. There's a recent television series of Brave New World. I watched the first 10 minutes and then I had to abandon ship because there were too many woke smoke signals going up for me, and it just looked like a sort of Porsche TV ad or something. I mean, who knows? But 10 minutes in, and I abandoned ship. I didn't like the look of it in one way or another at all. But let's Ed, let's dive in to these images that I've pulled out of this graphic novel of Brave New World, just so we can get a taste of the world that he builds. So this is one of the opening graphics from the book, and it's the central London hatchery. So in Aldous Huxley's dystopian future, which is set in the year 632 or something, the year is AF, which means after Ford. So Ford is the new sort of central figure, and that's obviously a satire. What people forget a lot actually about Brave New World, people tend to see it as fairly dry these days, but actually it's an incredibly satirical book, quite funny at times, but it helps if you know some of the figures that it's satirizing, and if you know some of the names of the politics and the public world of the time. So Ford is clearly Henry Ford, the fellow who released his Model T Ford in 1908, a pivotal year for Aldous Huxley. It was also the year that his mother died. But Henry Ford released the Model T Ford in 1908 and revolutionized this sort of mechanized method of standardized production, factory production. And Ford was extremely famous for this at the time, having this very efficient, standardized method of factory production. So Huxley is obviously satirizing that, and he's making a worldview where people and their emotions and their behaviors are as efficiently produced. I would suggest this is what he's satirizing, as if they were a Model T Ford produced in one of Henry Ford's factories. And this is where people are bred. People no longer are born. The stork does not deliver people in the dystopian future of Brave New World. Instead, people are bred in hatcheries. This is the central London hatchery. This is from the graphic novel, an image of babies basically grown in hatcheries or test tubes or bottles. In fact, they're described as in the book. There is, in this dystopian future, there is no mother and there is no father. In fact, the terms mother and father are seen as insults. They are seen as primitive and disgusting and dirty concepts from a distant, dim past. And if anybody uses the word mother, it is seen as insulting to somebody. So human reproduction has been completely divorced from the natural history of humanity. People are produced like Ford motor cars in a factory. And there are, Ed, let's move on to the next one. There are different castes of people, different social classes of people who are deliberately engineered in these factories. You have alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons. These are the different levels of society. They are chemically engineered in these factories. They are engineered through the addition of alcohol and other chemicals to lower the IQ of the lower classes. The lower classes are also, while they're in embryonic form, They are denied oxygen, and there are various other methods that they use to breed these scientifically and deliberately created different classes of people with different abilities. The alphas are the leadership class. They have the highest intelligence, and the epsilons, for example, and the deltas are the lowest classes, and they are, we would consider by today's terms, barely human. They are not capable of emotion or intellect. They simply carry out tasks that are assigned to them. The small cadre of leaders of this society are described as his Ford ship, yet another allusion to Henry Ford. And the leader of that society in Brave New World is his Ford ship, Mustafa Mond, who is in fact one of the characters of the book. So what we have here, we have this dystopian future where children are entirely raised by the state. There is no role for parents. Parents, mother, father, have been entirely eliminated from the process of conception, birth, and child rearing. The idea that there might be people who have a direct biological and emotional and stewardship connection to children is by this time regarded as a disgusting concept, a disgusting, primitive, and revolting concept. Babies are raised with all sorts of subliminal messaging and imprinting in various ways. There are various slogans which are used to impress upon people this the makeup of their society, the social mores of this new society. One of those is ending is better than mending. There it is there. These messages are displayed everywhere in banners and advertisements and loudspeakers, and these social nudging messages are everywhere. And this is one of them. Ending is better than mending. That's about relationships, actually. It's seen as uncouth and antisocial to have a long-term romantic or marriage relationship with anybody. It is essentially illegal, and it is certainly very heavily discouraged. And so people are encouraged to have brief sexual relationships with people, no enduring relationships of any kind. And ending is better than mending. It's much better to move on rather than attempt to have any sort of long-term relationship. Another slogan that they use on the population is "everybody belongs to everybody." This again encourages people not to have any kind of long-term, deep relationships with anybody else. Everybody belongs to everybody. People are encouraged to have brief sexual encounters with as many partners as they can possibly manage. That is seen as healthy. People are told that that is healthy, and there is a lot of peer group pressure on people. And if people develop some sort of long-term romantic feelings for anybody in particular, that is heavily discouraged. Everybody belongs to everybody. And along those lines, I just wanted to briefly show you two images from this recent television series of Brave New World. Like I said, I watched the first 10 minutes and I had to abandon ship. But one of their posters from this TV show actually bears the slogan, "Everybody belongs to everybody." Ed, if you could pull it up, please. And that in the TV show, that was really emphasized in a kind of salacious way, and as a way of, I suspect, dragging in an audience actually while we were watching it. I thought that it was kind of more like Brave New World meets Love Island. If you don't know what Love Island is, count yourself lucky. It's one of these horrific English reality TV shows. Anyway, Ed, I don't know, do we have those two images from the TV show there? Okay, well then let's just move on. We're probably better off without them, I'd say. Let's move on to the Freemartins. These are people who are bred to be sterile. In fact, a large swathe of the population in Brave New World are bred to be sterile, and then the others are encouraged to use state-provided contraception. Here's a description of breeding the Freemartins, of which there is a lot. And then if we move on, there's another one of these sayings which are pushed upon the public: hug me till you drug me. And it's actually really it's well presented in the graphic novel, I have to say. The graphics are sort of hallucinogenic, and people are encouraged to take a drug in Brave New World called Soma. This is one of the ways that the population is rendered incredibly docile. This drug Soma, and you can see a little bit of the advertisement for it in the corner of that image, is heavily foisted upon the public. There are all sorts of slogans about, taking 1 Soma a day, or 2 if you're feeling the blues, or 3 if you've had a hell of a day. The population is encouraged strongly to drug away all questions and all doubts and all problems through the use of this state-produced and state-enforced and state-encouraged drug called Soma. And so then there's also on the youth, babies, and everybody, in fact, there is the use of hypnopedia, which is a method of, while people are asleep, you can implant, I guess subliminally, you might call it, messages and ideas and thoughts into their heads. And there's a lot of this subliminal implanting going on in the world of Huxley's Brave New World. There are also, so on the one hand, the population is self-medicating so that it can remain stable and obedient. And on the other hand, you have all sorts of entertainments and distractions. One of them is called obstacle golf. So the population is encouraged to engage in all sorts of trivial entertainments. These are basically written into everyone's daily schedule, is time for trivial entertainments. One of those is obstacle golf. There's another one called the Feelies, and that is somewhat akin to cinema or to popular culture. So generally, often every day, people will partake in the Feelies, which are a bit like motion pictures, movies, but they appear to have a sort of sensual and 3D aspect, and they appear to engage a lot of the people's senses and emotions and sensuality. And it's an ironic thing, because Aldous Huxley was notorious with his friends for hating cinema. In fact, he found it mawkish and sentimental and manipulative. He didn't go to the cinema. He didn't like it. And in another aspect of the satire of Brave New World, and there's satire happening on every level in Brave New World, is the Feelies, this sort of public ritual where people engage with this distracting, overwhelming, sexually charged entertainment. on a regular basis, often every day. In contrast to this dystopian, although clearly it's meant to be a utopian society, there's also a small caste of people known as the savages. These are the people who, for one reason or another, have rejected this society. They've turned their back on it, and they live in reservations way outside the populated areas, behind high fences, high electrified and controlled fences are the savage reservations. That's where the people who have either been expelled from the Brave New World society, as some people have been, for political wrongthink or emotional or social wrongthink, or people who've simply chosen to turn their back on that society. They live in these savage reservations. And so this is, in essence, the world that Aldous Huxley has constructed in Brave New World. It's a future where totalitarians, it's often been remarked, can either work with the stick, the sort of Stalinist, Maoist style of totalitarianism, where you beat people, you terrorize them, you frighten them, you disappear them, you starve them until they do what you want. Or there is, of course, the carrot method. And some people have argued that in the 20th century, the Soviet Union, for example, and China were both excellent examples of the stick method of totalitarianism. But some, including Huxley, and we'll get to that shortly, argued that the West was the carrot method of totalitarianism, as in give people, the best kind of slaves, the best kind of obedient workers and functionaries are the people who don't even realize their own enslavement, who are so obsessed with consumerism in Brave New World that they also are endlessly consuming things. They throw things away. It's deemed as retrograde and repulsive to attempt to repair anything. You just throw it away and get a new one. People are obsessed with new products and being consumers, and they engage in mindless distractions and entertainments, and they are also cast into this sort of hypnotic state by endless omniscient propaganda, and in fact they're even drugged into it through soma. And that, in a nutshell, is the very interesting, very relevant world constructed in Aldous Huxley's satire, Brave New World. Now, the book was a critical hit when it was released in England in 1932. It was reportedly sold well, and these numbers are interesting, I think. It reportedly, the book sold 13,000 copies in the first year and 10,000 copies in the second year in the UK, which was regarded as very good sales, and it was definitely a critical hit. In the US, however, it was not. People didn't like it. There was a backlash against the book. There were calls to ban the book, actually, because many people felt that it was sexually degenerate and it morally degenerate and encouraged degenerate behavior in people. So there were calls in the US to ban the book, although, as I said, in the UK, it was considered to be an outstanding piece of satire. This really put, actually, Huxley was well known already. He'd had a couple of well-considered novels before this, but this is certainly the book that put him on the map as a writer. But interestingly, those numbers don't really make you a wealthy person. So he still struggled financially, and he ended up, because of his health, but also for financial reasons, he in fact moved to Hollywood. That's not an aspect of his life that's particularly well studied, except for this chunky and actually very interesting book. He moved to Hollywood for health reasons, or to California for health reasons, and took a well-paying job in the Hollywood film studios as a writer. He was being paid $2,500 a week, which in 1940 was a considerable amount of money. He put his name to one or two films like Pride and Prejudice and one or two others, but he did a lot of work uncredited on scripts of films. He also wrote a screenplay for Alice in Wonderland for Walt Disney that was rejected and never filmed. And I think that's now been found, but it was lost for many decades. But he did write a screenplay of Alice in Wonderland, but it was never filmed. And he kept writing novels while he worked in Hollywood. We'll get to some of those shortly. But the next book that is relevant to us right now, and we're going to dive into in depth, is this book from 1958, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World Revisited. Now, you could consider this as a bit of a sort of victory lap book. Brave New World was a well-known book, published in 1932. This came out in 1958, and Aldous Huxley is basically sounding all sorts of alarm bells. And in here he says, I projected the future of Brave New World hundreds of years in the future. I now unfortunately realize that this future is getting closer and closer by the day. He's quite alarmed by how close that future appears to be. And he was ringing those alarm bells in this book. And this book is kind of forgotten today, but it's actually a very, very interesting book. He takes apart the world that he had constructed in Brave New World and notes all sorts of developments in society that he would argue are rushing us towards a future, in fact, very similar to Brave New World. And Ed, if we can pull up the slides of Brave New World Revisited, there's just a different cover for Brave New World Revisited. There's the table of contents, which is very interesting. Huxley was, he came from a family that did have a deep interest, and he had this interest as well, in eugenics, in the improvement of the species. Obviously, that's a topic and a science that copped a bit of a bad reputation, especially during the Second World War. But let's not forget that there were strong eugenicist movements in the US and the UK prior to the Second World War, and his family were involved in those movements, as was Aldous Huxley. So he was quite concerned about overpopulation. I'm not saying that that's a irrelevant concern necessarily, though I have to inject my personal view here. I have my own personal doubts about the population numbers that we are given for this planet. I'm just not entirely convinced about them. And if you wanted to push the agenda of depopulation, for example, you would have every reason to exaggerate population numbers. So I'm not entirely convinced about the alleged population numbers that are used to frighten us about overpopulation. But nevertheless, Aldous Huxley was concerned about that. He then goes into a talk about over-organization, which and we'll read some sections from the book shortly, actually. But he was concerned about too much bureaucracy, too much political meddling, too much control, too many avenues that could clearly lead to totalitarianism. In this book, he is desperately concerned about what he sees as the impending arrival of totalitarianism. He sees it arriving through what he calls over-organization, too much bureaucracy, too much power placed in the hands of heavily politicized institutions. He's also extremely concerned about And he mentions this book actually a number of times, Vance Packard's The Hidden Persuaders, about propaganda and how propaganda has been sharpened and has become incredibly effective. This book was about the power of propaganda and the power of advertising, and how advertising used and could use and was using all sorts of psychological techniques to convince people of things that powerful people wanted them to be convinced of. This book, The Hidden Persuaders, is considered a classic in that regard by Vance Packard. Huxley mentions it a number of times, and that also leads to obviously books like these ones. There's Jacques Ellul book, Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes, another book from Ellul, a French philosopher who shared Huxley's concerns. This one's The Technological Society. They were worried. Many of these intellectuals and writers and people were worried about what they saw as the advance of technology. The Aldous Huxley himself said that he hated television. He refused to watch television as he found it a highly manipulative medium. There's a book that I've taken some inspiration from called The Plug-in Drug. I actually wrote a song called that at one stage a couple of years back. Here's 4 arguments for the elimination of television by Jerry Mander. Jerry Mander, that's apparently his real name, however. So Ed, if we can move on, and right at the end of Brave New World Revisited, he touches on what can possibly be done about this march towards totalitarianism. So if we dive into the first chapter, in 1931, when Brave New World was being written, I was convinced that there was still plenty of time. The completely organized society, the scientific caste system, the abolition of free will by methodical conditioning, the servitude made acceptable by regular doses of chemically induced happiness, the orthodoxies drummed in by nightly courses of sleep teaching, these things were coming all right, but not in my time, not even in the time of my grandchildren. 27 years later, however, in this third quarter of the 20th century AD, and long before the end of the first century after Ford, that's a remark relating to Brave New World, I feel a good deal less optimistic than I did when I was writing Brave New World. That's interesting, isn't it? By 1958, he's feeling a good deal less optimistic than when he wrote Brave New World. The prophecies made in 1931, he obviously wrote the book in 31 and it was published in 32, are coming true much sooner than I thought they would. In the West, it is true, individual men and women still enjoy a large measure of freedom. But even in those countries that have a tradition of democratic government, this freedom and even the desire for this freedom seem to be on the wane. That means, they're diminishing, they're disappearing. In the rest of the world, freedom for individuals has already gone, or is manifestly about to go. The nightmare of total organization, which I had situated in the 7th century after Ford, has emerged from the safe remote future and is awaiting us just around the next corner. But assuming for the moment that the great powers can somehow refrain from destroying us, he's talking about the First World War and the Second World War, which obviously had a huge effect on vast amounts of people. But assuming for the moment, and people had become, especially in these artistic intellectual circles and wider circles as well, obviously, people had become really quite jaded about the future after the First and Second World War. But assuming for the moment that the great powers can somehow refrain from destroying us, we can say that it now looks as though the odds were more in favor of something like Brave New World than of something like 1984. So he was making comparisons between Brave New World and 1984. As I said, Orwell had been a student of Aldous Huxley's. Aldous Huxley had written a letter to Orwell soon after 1984 was released, congratulating him, actually, very warmly congratulating him on the book and saying that he thought the book was excellent, but that he still thought that most likely, as the future moved on, most likely his vision of a totalitarian future would, in the end, be more accurate than Orwell's. And he suggested in his letter that societies, countries, nations might go through a lot of this sort of Stalinist, brutal stick treatment, but then ultimately governments would realize that the carrot was generally a more effective way of controlling people and making them obedient. In the light of what we have recently learned about animal behavior in general and human behavior in particular, it has become clear that control through the punishment of undesirable behavior is less effective in the long run than control through the reinforcement of desirable behavior by rewards, and that government through terror works on the whole less well than government through the non-violent manipulation of the environment and the thoughts and feelings of individual men, women, and children. The society described in 1984 is a society controlled almost exclusively by punishment and the fear of punishment. In the imaginary world of my own fable, punishment is infrequent and generally mild. The nearly perfect control exercised by the government is achieved by systematic reinforcement of desirable behavior, by many kinds of nearly non-violent manipulation, both physical and psychological, and by genetic standardization. In Russia, the old-fashioned, and he's obviously writing this during the era of the Soviet Union, in Russia, the old-fashioned 1984-style dictatorship of Stalin has begun to give way to a more up-to-date form of tyranny. In the upper levels of the Soviets' hierarchical society, the reinforcement of desirable behavior has begun to replace the older methods of control through the punishment of undesirable behavior. Engineers and scientists, teachers and administrators are handsomely paid for good work and so moderately taxed that they are under a constant incentive to do better and so be more highly rewarded. Actually reminds me of Australia. Anyway, in certain areas, they are at liberty to think and do more or less what they like. Punishment awaits them only when they stray beyond their prescribed limits into the realms of ideology and politics. It is because they have been granted a measure of professional freedom that Russian teachers, scientists, and technicians have achieved such remarkable successes. So what Huxley is talking about here, he's talking about the carrot versus the stick. And I think this is entirely applicable to our society. Here in Australia, we have a very fanatical, really, and orthodox collaborator class, I call them. And those collaborators are well rewarded in the professional, media, and bureaucratic classes. They are very well rewarded as long as they toe the line, as long as they do not espouse wrong think, as long as they do not leave the reservation where they are rewarded to stay. Those who fear the base of the Soviet pyramid, those near the base of the Soviet pyramid enjoy none of the privileges accorded to the lucky or specially gifted minority. Their wages are meager, and their pay, in the form of high prices, a disproportionately large share of the taxes. The area in which they can do as they please is extremely restricted, and their rulers control them more by punishment and the threat of punishment than through non-violent manipulation or the reinforcement of desirable behavior by reward. The Soviet system combines elements of 1984 with elements that are prophetic of what went on among the higher castes in Brave New World. I would argue that that actually is remarkably similar to the situation in Australia and other Western countries today. What's described as the lower class people socioeconomically have a lot less disposable income. They have a lot less reward. They are taxed far, far more highly because they spend all of their income on, essentials or white goods or trinkets or whatever. And then you have these higher castes who are infinitely rewarded for their obedience. And in Australia, I call them the collaborator class or the professional class, the kind of people who inhabit the media, the ABC, the Guardian, or all these kind of things. It's remarkably similar, I would suggest. Meanwhile, impersonal forces over which we have almost no control seem to be pushing us all in the direction of Brave New Worldian nightmare. And this impersonal pushing is being consciously accelerated by representatives of commercial and political organizations who have developed a number of new techniques for manipulating, in the interest of some minority, the thoughts and feelings of the masses. In the brave new world of my fantasy, eugenics and dysgenics were practiced systematically. In one set of bottles, biologically superior ova, fertilized by biologically superior sperm, were given the best possible prenatal treatment and were finally decanted as betas, alphas, and even alpha pluses. In another, much more numerous set of bottles, biologically inferior ova, fertilized by biologically inferior sperm, were subjected to the Bokansky process, 96 identical twins out of a single egg, and treated prenatally with alcohol and other protein poisons. The creatures finally decanted were almost subhuman, but they were capable of performing unskilled work and, when properly conditioned, detensioned by free and frequent access to the opposite sex, constantly distracted by gratuitous entertainment and reinforced in their good behavior patterns by daily doses of soma, could be counted on to give no trouble to their superiors. That reminds me of how much fast food is pushed on poor people, essentially, how much the fast food market is basically shoved down the throat of working class people, etc., etc. I personally don't think any of that's a coincidence. Anyway, I could go on about that, but Ed, let's keep moving. Now, Chapter 7 in Brave New World Revisited touches on brainwashing, a fascinating topic. And he starts talking about the scientist, Ivan Pavlov, who conducted epoch-making experiments on the conditioned reflex. Ivan Pavlov observed that when subjected to prolonged physical or psychic stress, laboratory animals exhibit all the symptoms of a nervous breakdown. Refusing to cope any longer with the intolerable situation, their brains go on strike, so to speak, and either stop working altogether, the dog loses consciousness, or else resort to slowdowns and sabotage. The dog behaves unrealistically or develops the kind of physical symptoms which in a human being would be called hysterical. This is getting into a very interesting domain. If you've been paying attention the last 3 years, I would suggest this might be sounding a little bit familiar to you. Some animals are more resistant to stress than others. The findings were confirmed in the most distressing manner and on a very large scale during the two world wars, that's World War I and World War II, as the result of a single catastrophic experience or of a succession of terrors less appalling but frequently repeated. Soldiers develop a number of disabling psychophysical symptoms: temporary unconsciousness, extreme agitation, lethargy, functional blindness, or paralysis, completely unrealistic responses to the challenge of events, strange reversals of lifelong patterns of behavior. All the symptoms which Pavlov observed in his dogs reappeared among the victims of what the First World War was in the First World War was called shell shock. In the second, battle fatigue. Every man, like every dog, has his own individual limit of endurance. At the end of the treatment, the prisoner will be in a state of neurosis or hysteria and will be ready to confess whatever his captors want him to confess. So Huxley's moved. I've moved along here. This is a different excerpt, but he's talking about the treatment of prisoners in jails and so forth, and in the sort of gulag situation. And the treatment of, say, for example, secret police. And he notes that confession is not enough. A hopeless neurotic is no use to anyone. What the intelligent and practical dictator needs is not a patient to be institutionalized or a victim to be shot, but a convert who will work for the cause. This might be sounding familiar. Turning once again to Pavlov, he learns that on their way to the point of final breakdown, dogs become more than normally suggestible. New behavior patterns can easily be installed while the dog is at or near the limit of its cerebral endurance. This, to me, really reminds me of the last couple of years in Victoria, Australia, where we are. This constant pattern of stress and release, lockdown, somewhat removed, lockdown back on, fear applied, fear somewhat removed, fear applied again. This is if you were designing a situation to psychologically break people and to make them as malleable as possible, the research of Ivan Pavlov, which Aldous Huxley is summarizing here, would appear to be extremely relevant. I don't think this is a coincidence myself. Turning once again to Pavlov, he learns that on their way to the point of final breakdown, dogs become more than normally suggestible. New behavior patterns can easily be installed while the dog is at or near the limit of its cerebral endurance. And these new behavior patterns seem to be ineradicable, as in they can't be, once they're put in place, these new behavior patterns, they cannot be removed. The animal in which they have been implanted cannot be deconditioned. That which it has learned under stress will remain an integral part of its makeup. Is this ringing any alarm bells for any of you? It's certainly ringing some for me. Intense, prolonged fear broke them down and produced a state of greatly intensified suggestibility. In this state, they were able to accept the preachers, and he's talking about a particular example of a revivalist preacher. In this state, they were able to accept the preacher's theological pronouncements without question because of the stress mindset they had been put in. After which they were reintegrated by words of comfort and emerged from their ordeal with new and generally better behavior patterns ineradicably implanted in their minds and nervous systems. I would suggest to you that this pattern, these behaviors that are suggested by this, the research of Pavlov, are applied by tyrants and despots, and they are deliberately applied. Stress and reward, stress and comfort. I'm suggesting to you that we have seen these patterns very clearly and very evidently in recent years. The effectiveness of political and religious propaganda depends upon the methods employed, not upon the doctrines taught. These doctrines may be true or false, wholesome or pernicious. It makes little or no difference. If the indoctrination is given in the right way at the proper stage of nervous exhaustion, It will work. Under favorable conditions, practically everybody can be converted to practically anything. Such he's then we skip ahead. This is a different excerpt from just a little bit further along. He talks about the possibility of change through legislation that outlaws brainwashing techniques and outlaws coercion. However, such preventative legislation might do some good, but if the great impersonal forces now menacing freedom continue to gather momentum, they cannot do much good for very long. The best of constitutions and preventative laws will be powerless against the steadily increasing pressures of overpopulation and of the over-organization imposed by growing numbers and advancing technology. Yes, Aldous Huxley was very concerned about the possibility and the power of technology to be used for totalitarianism. The constitutions will not be abrogated and the good laws will remain on the statute book, but these liberal forms will merely serve as decoration and adorn a profoundly illiberal substance. So what he's saying is that all the window dressing of democracy will continue to exist. There'll be elections, for example, and this supposed contest of ideas that the media presents, but this will all be a charade. And actually, what you'll have behind this comforting mirage of democracy, elections, etc., 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 will in fact be the mechanism of totalitarianism. Under the relentless thrust of accelerating overpopulation and increasing overorganization, and by means of ever more effective methods of mind manipulation, the democracies will change their nature. The quaint old forms, elections, parliaments, supreme courts, and all the rest will remain. The underlying substance will be a new kind of non-violent totalitarianism. All the traditional names, all the hallowed slogans will remain exactly what they were in the good old days. Democracy and freedom will be the theme of every broadcast and editorial, but democracy and freedom in a strictly Pickwickian sense, that is a fraudulent, merely superficial sense. Meanwhile, the ruling oligarchy and its highly trained elite of soldiers, policemen, thought manufacturers, and mind manipulators will quietly run the show as they see fit. At this point, we find ourselves confronted by a very disturbing question. Do we really wish to act upon our knowledge? Does the majority of the population think it worthwhile to take a good deal of trouble in order to halt and, if possible, reverse the current drift toward totalitarian control of everything? In the United States, and America is the prophetic image of the rest of the urban industrial world, as it will be a few years from now, recent public opinion polls have revealed that an actual majority of young people in their teens and the voters of tomorrow have no faith in democratic institutions, see no objection to the censorship of unpopular ideas, do not believe that government of the people by the people is possible, and would be perfectly content if they can continue to live in the style to which they have become accustomed to be ruled from above by an oligarchy of assorted experts. Too many of the well-fed young television watchers in the world's most powerful democracy should be so completely so many of them should be so completely indifferent to the idea of self-government, so blankly uninterested in freedom of thought and the right to dissent, is distressing, but not too surprising. Free as a bird, we say, and envy the winged creatures for their power of unrestricted movement in all the three dimensions. But alas, we forget the dodo. Any bird that has learned how to grub up a good living without being compelled to use its wings will soon renounce the privilege of flight. And remain forever grounded. Something analogous is true of human beings. If the bread is supplied regularly and copiously 3 times a day, Many of them will be perfectly content to live by bread alone, or at least by bread and circuses alone. In the end, says the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's parable, in the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, make us your slaves and feed us. And when Karamazov asks his brother, the teller of the story, if the Grand Inquisitor is speaking ironically, Ivan answers, not a bit of it. Indeed, bread and circuses is what we are talking about here. Ed, let's move on. The young people who now think so poorly of democracy may grow up to become fighters for freedom, however. The cry of give me television and hamburgers, but don't bother me with the responsibilities of liberty may give place, under altered circumstances, to the cry of give me liberty or give me death. If such a revolution takes place, it will be due in part to the operation of forces over which even the most powerful rulers have very little control. In part to the incompetence of those rulers, their inability to make effective use of the mind-manipulating instruments with which science and technology have supplied and will go on supplying the would-be tyrant. Considering how little they knew and how poorly they were equipped, the Grand Inquisitors of earlier times did remarkably well. But the successors, the well-informed, thoroughly scientific dictators of the future, may do better. Meanwhile, there is still some freedom left in the world. Many young people, it is true, do not seem to value freedom. But some of us still believe that without freedom, human beings cannot become fully human, and that freedom is therefore supremely valuable. Perhaps the forces that now menace freedom are too strong to be resisted for very long. It is still our duty to do whatever we can to resist them. Now, we come to the final chapter of Brave New World Revisited, chapter 12. I'll just read a few brief excerpts from chapter 12. What can be done? Aldous Huxley, writing in 1958, did feel that it wasn't too late to resist totalitarianism, though he was ringing the alarm bells, even in 1958, very, very loudly. Ed, let's move on to the next slide. Oh, there's a little graphic about the comparisons between 1984 and Brave New World. Let's keep moving, Ed. No, I think we're missing some slides of chapter 12, perhaps. Anyway, that's all right. We can keep moving. I did want to remark upon that what that last graphic showed, and that is the idea which some people have raised, and I've raised it indeed in the past, and that is that the world that we are living in now. Yes, thank you, Ed. That the world we're living in now is some kind of synthesis of Brave New World and 1984. And I would also suggest, and I've suggested this before, incorporating elements of H.G. Wells's New World Order and The Open Conspiracy, also by H.G. Wells. And I don't think look, I've read a lot of books by these fellows, and I've read a lot about them. I don't think any of them were nefarious players. I don't think any of them had ill intent. But as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think and this is just my point of view. Some people have suggested that Aldous Huxley, was an elitist, and that actually Brave New World is what he and his clansmen wished for the future. That's not my view. I from what I know of Aldous Huxley and those excerpts that I've just read to you from Brave New World Revisited, I think it should be fairly clear, and he lived this in many ways, that he did not wish a totalitarian future upon humanity at all, but he was deeply concerned about it, and he was ringing alarm bells about it very, very loudly. But I do think this literature has been used by other darker forces and other pernicious players and operatives that I think, in my view, they have mined these bodies of literature for and treated them like how-to manuals, which they were not designed to be, in my view, at all. But I think the forces of darkness have nevertheless utilized them partly as how-to-do manuals for totalitarianism, because if you harvest them in that manner, there's a lot of ideas in there which are very useful to the totalitarian. And as I said earlier on, we do have this synthesis in our societies. I mean, here, just in humble, old, sleepy Victoria, Australia, we've seen the carrot, we've seen propaganda, we've seen distraction, we've seen messages of comfort and solace. We've also seen the stick. We've seen armored vehicles, sonic weapons, rubber bullets being fired at people. We've also seen treaties being signed and arrangements being signed behind the public's back. That is one of the things that H.G. Wells actually advocated for in the New World Order and the Open Conspiracy. He actually advocated for a one world government, but he knew that the public wouldn't go for it. So he suggested doing it behind their back through international agreements and unaccountable bodies. For example, just being hypothetical, like the UN or the WHO or the WEF, or these unaccountable international bodies would be an excellent way to bring in a one world government. Wells wanted that one world government to establish world peace and to resist the power of corporations, but it's easy to see how his good intentions have paved the road to hell. Aldous Huxley died, unsurprisingly, everybody does, but he died on the, he contracted cancer, and he died on the 22nd of November 1963. His then wife, his first wife Maria, had died of cancer. His second wife Laura, on his request, dosed him up with mescaline. I've read just before midday on the 22nd of November 1963, so that Aldous could have a psychedelic departure from this world. He had in recent years become an advocate of psychedelics. In fact, he had written this book, The Doors of Perception, in which he advocated the responsible use of hallucinogens and psychedelics, especially in treating mental illness, depression, and also he advocated them for the use of simply expanding one's consciousness. This is also a pivotal Aldous Huxley book. It became a college campus and dorm room staple across universities and colleges in the 60s and 70s in particular. Even the 60s rock band, The Doors, reportedly took their name from this book, The Doors of Perception. Anyway, reportedly, according to his wife Laura, Aldous hallucinated very peacefully his way out of this world on the 22nd of November 1963. Also, very interestingly, another great author died on that exact same day, C.S. Lewis, who wrote this book, which I think is fantastic, the Screwtape Letters, about the existence of evil and the battle against evil in the spiritual and the physical world. He wrote other books like this one, Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis, a great writer, C.S. Lewis. He also died on the 22nd of November 1963, but all of their deaths were overshadowed by other events on that day, most notably being the assassination of John F. Kennedy that happened on the 22nd of November 1963. There is John F. Kennedy's wife, Jackie, scrambling out the back of their limousine to find pieces of his skull that had been blown off. The shock and the trauma of John F. Kennedy's very public assassination, which we have touched on before on All Out of Bubblegum and the Forbidden Book Club, left the public in such a state of shock and trauma that the death of Aldous Huxley was very much overlooked. I find it very interesting that all of those personages died on the same day. I'm not suggesting the work, aside from John F. Kennedy, of assassins or some sort of physical intervention there. I do find it interesting that Aldous Huxley was hallucinating on mescaline at the very moment. He'd been dosed up about 45 minutes before John F. Kennedy was assassinated. When at the moment of the assassination, he was on Aldous Huxley was on a different plane of existence. I find that interesting. I do ponder, yes, the same day, all of them on the same day, within hours of each other. I do ponder the concept of synchronicity there. I do wonder, and this is simply my hypothesis, I realize I'm entering the Twilight Zone here. I wonder if that's some sort of occult announcement of a new age, ushering in a new age of totalitarianism or control or obedience, ushering in a new age of darkness. That is simply a hypothesis that I'm advancing. I do find it striking that those three persons all died on the same day. Aldous Huxley, while he's a iconic but largely ignored figure today, at the time he was a major figure in popular culture and literature. He wrote hundreds of essays, around 50 or so novels. He was considered an absolutely major figure in literature and a major public intellectual. I wanted to touch on very briefly some of Aldous Huxley's legacy in this world today, in case you happen to think, well, it's just some old dusty old book. How on earth could that be relevant to anything? Ed, if you could pull up a couple of pieces we have. This is from the last week or so, I believe. It's a piece about birthing pods. Some scientists have suggested the practicality of birthing pods. That is precisely what the picture that Aldous Huxley painted in his dystopia, Brave New World. That is people being born in a factory-like manner, in a Fordian-like manner. Ed, if you want to go down and see some of the images there, they've got proposed images of this kind of human factory farming kind of stuff going on. Yes, this just looks precisely like Aldous Huxley to me. Don't forget the alarm bells that Aldous Huxley was ringing in Brave New World Revisited. We now have scientists proposing this exact method of bringing people into the world, the most anti-human, sterile process that one could possibly imagine. Mind that as Aldous Huxley satirically at the time painted in Brave New World, you also it's quite alarming how much that looks like the images in the Brave New World graphic novel as well. Aldous Huxley also satirically painted a future where using the words mother and father would be deemed to be offensive and insulting. And what do you know? Even in sleepy little Australia, a bunch of breastfeeding advisors, and we've seen this across the culture. These are just sporadic, almost random examples of this. We've seen this across the culture. Breastfeeding counselors were fired because they refused to give up using the word mother when referring to breastfeeding mothers. They were admonished to speak of chest feeding parents, but some of the breastfeeding advisors refused that propaganda. They refused that groupthink, and they insisted on using the word mother, and they were fired from their positions because of that refusal. That was just a few months back in sleepy old Australia. And as I said, this is happening all over the place. So if you get the chilling feeling that Brave New World is upon us, I would suggest you might not be alone. This book seems more timely and relevant than ever. I would suggest frighteningly timely and relevant. Of course, as I've suggested on this program before, and as is painted very vividly in Brave New World, if you want to control people, if you want people to be fundamentally obedient and compliant, the best way, as all totalitarians know, as all despots know, is to cut them off from their roots, cut them off from real experience, cut them off from family, cut them off from relationships, atomize them, make them simply individual, lonely units who can be easily controlled. This was one of the key themes that Aldous Huxley was suggesting in Brave New World, and we are seeing these themes now playing out before our eyes, I would suggest. I just wanted to make a few quick little notes about the last years of Aldous Huxley's life. Yes, he did move to Hollywood, sort of reasonably ineffectually in some ways. He wrote a film or two and then wrote a bunch of other screenplays that were never filmed. And that was, of course, as I remarked earlier on, that was highly ironic, seeing that he, earlier in his life, he declared that he hated films and cinema. He thought it was sentimental, mawkish, manipulative nonsense. But ironically now, I know you might find this hard to believe, he was broke and he supposedly took the gig because he wanted the money. It was a very productive time for him socially. He got to hang out with lots of interesting people. He became friends with Krishnamurti, for example, the very interesting Indian philosopher. They became very close friends. Aldous Huxley actually wrote the introduction to the most famous Krishnamurti book. There it is, The First and Last Freedom. Aldous Huxley wrote an extensive introduction to his book, and they were very close friends, spent a lot of time together, which I think is very interesting. And later in his life, Huxley, although he had been raised in a family that was directly connected to Darwinism and evolution. He became a very spiritual person, and wrote extensively about spiritual matters, and lived in a very spiritual fashion. There's another copy of that Krishnamurti book, The First and Last Freedom. There's a Krishnamurti postage stamp. I couldn't resist. Quite an iconic figure in some circles, very close friends with Aldous Huxley. There are, obviously, Brave New World is the best known book of Aldous Huxley, but there are a number of, if you're interested, there are a number of other Aldous Huxley books that are really worth reading. Certainly Brave New World is, but also there is this book from 1948, Ape and Essence. It's a biting satire of the Cold War. It's a jaded post-World War II satire of human society, where there is a society of baboons who have nuclear weapons and threaten or do hurl them at each other consistently. It's actually an excellent book, Ape and Essence. I really do recommend it. There's also this very interesting Huxley book, The Devils of Lodon, which was made, it's about frictions, schisms, and other activities in the church in France. It was made into a very remarkable Ken Russell film that's just called The Devils. There's a hardback version of it, Devils of Lodon, an excellent book, which I highly recommend, from 1952. I mentioned earlier The Doors of Perception, which is about, it's Huxley writing about his psychedelic experiences. He conducted a very methodical and controlled experiments in psychedelics on himself, and he writes about them in that book. Then there is his very last novel, Aldous Huxley's very last novel, from 1962, the year before he died. It's called Island. I highly recommend it. It's a kind of counterpoint to Brave New World. It's this sort of attempt as an opposite, in a way, to Brave New World. Brave New World is a dystopia. It's a warning. It's a cautionary tale. Huxley is saying very loudly, this is not what we want for our future. We have to be careful. In Ireland, he paints a potential utopia in a fashion. It's actually a very funny book. It's very satirical, very funny. It's about a little island. Sounds a bit like Sri Lanka or something. It's off the coast. It sounds like off the coast of India or somewhere. That it turns out has massive oil supplies, and people battle these oil supplies, and the inhabitants of the island are very spiritually advanced, and they don't really want to be caught in this sort of corporate net, etc., etc., etc. I highly recommend it, actually. That's Aldous Huxley's Island from 1962, his very last novel. And there's a bunch of other ones, that some of which are actually very interesting as well. Anyway, I'm sure that's enough. I apologize if that's gone on for too long, but there's a lot to cover there, and we've actually skated across the surface. There's a lot more that we could have covered in there. But Ed, you're absolutely right. alloutofbubblegum.net. That is the All Out of Bubblegum website, alloutofbubblegum.net. You can go to alloutofbubblegum.net. You can see previous episodes of All Out of Bubblegum, some of which have been excised, cancelled, removed, censored, nuked from various platforms, but all previous episodes of All Out of Bubblegum and the Forbidden Book Club are available on alloutofbubblegum.net. You can also listen to episodes via that website as podcasts and on Spotify and all these various other platforms. If you desire the content, but not my ugly mug, that's where you should go. So go to alloutofbubblegum.net. You can also support alloutofbubblegum.there. That would be most appreciated. And the people who have previously supported this program, you have our sincere appreciation. The people who have suggested books, sent in books. They're all excellent suggestions, and I thank you most sincerely for those. Ed, it's probably time to wrap it up. Thank you for watching All Out of Bubblegum and the Forbidden Book Club. Ed, roll that video. And we're going to take a couple of weeks off over the Christmas break, and we will see you in the new year. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks after that break. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
Torn away from the light, caged in the dark, dark night, broken down, limbs of pain, shoulder to the wheel, onward again. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. Head bowed without sound, breathless bondage, but still unbound. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. The beast he paws at the gate. I pray, Lord, I hope it's not too late. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but my spirit is free. My body is in chains, but